Hi, welcome back to Pedagotech for English Teachers. I'm so happy you're here with me today. Today, I want to talk about something that I think quietly frustrates a lot of English teachers, especially those working in high school contexts where exams are a real pressure point. And I want to approach it in a way that hopefully reframes the whole thing because I think the frustration usually comes from asking the wrong question. The topic is heterogeneity, mixed proficiency. The fact that in any given class, you've got students who are basically fluent and students who are still working out how to form sentences in the past tense. And somehow, you're supposed to teach them all at once. Sound familiar? Pedagotech Episode 4. Welcome to Pedagotech for English Teachers, the podcast where we rethink English teaching for the 21st century. I'm Marcelo Lozana, and each episode will explore new ideas, tools, and reflection to help you teach smarter, not harder. Let's get started. Here's the moment I want you to picture. It's the beginning of the school year. You walk into your classroom, you look around, you realize this group is all over the place. Some of these students consume English language content every single day, podcasts, YouTube, games, social media. They're not just exposed to English, they're living in it, at least partially. And then right next to them, there's a student who still hesitates before a basic question in class, who aren't sure if they should use have or has, who are doing a lot of quiet and invisible struggling. And you, as the teacher, feel the pressure because if you're in an exam-driven context, which, let's be honest, a lot of us are, the gap doesn't feel uncomfortable. It feels like a problem you need to solve before you can even start teaching. So the question that forms in your head is something like, how do I teach the same content to students at completely different levels? And I want to stop right there because I think that question, as natural as it feels, is actually the source of a lot of the frustration. Not because it's wrong to ask it, but because of the assumption buried inside it. When we ask, how do I teach the same content to different levels, we are already assuming something. We are assuming that the content must be delivered the same way, at the same pace, with the same linguistic expectations to everyone in the room. And that assumption comes from a very old model of teaching, one that was designed around the idea of an average learner, the idea that somewhere in the middle of your class, there's a kind of representative student, and if you pitch your lesson to that person, most people will land close enough. But here's the thing. Learning sciences have been picking that idea apart for decades. Cognitive research is pretty clear that learners vary, not just in vocabulary or grammar knowledge, but in processing speed, working memory, prior exposure, metacognitive awareness, which is basically the capacity to reflect on your own learning. In second language acquisition specifically, the variability goes even deeper. Students differ in their input history, their motivation, their relationship to the language, even their sense of identity in relation to it. Proficiency isn't a clear linear scale. It's more like the surface of something much more complex underneath. So when we build the lesson around the idea of a uniform group, what we're actually doing is pretending that complexity doesn't exist. And it does. It just gets pushed into silence. Because here's what I observe, and I suspect a lot of you have seen this too. When instruction is too uniform, three things happen quietly. Students with lower proficiency go into what I would call survival mode. They're pattern matching, they're guessing, they're trying to stay afloat without necessarily understanding what's going on. They look like they're participating, but there's a lot of compensation happening under the surface. Students with higher proficiency disengage, not because they're being difficult, but because their cognitive demand isn't calling on them. And students, like all humans, need to be genuinely challenged in order to stay present. And the teacher? The teacher starts to feel like no choice is the right choice. Any decision leaves someone behind. That's not a classroom management problem. That's a design problem. Now, here's where I want to introduce distinction that I think is genuinely useful. There is a difference between the cognitive demand of a task and its linguistic complexity. A task can be cognitively demanding, and it can require inference, interpretation, analysis, critical thinking, while still being linguistically scaffolded for students who need that support. And conversely, a task can be linguistically dense without asking students to do much thinking at all. These two things often get conflated. We assume that a harder text means a harder task, but that's not necessarily true. And this matters enormously in exam-oriented contexts, because assessments like large-scale university entrance exams, which are very common here in Brazil, they're the kind that a lot of high school students are working towards here. Well, these tests, these exams, they're not really testing grammar in isolation. They're testing reading comprehension, yes, but specifically the kind of comprehension that requires inferential thinking, identifying an author's stance, recognizing how discourse is organized, understanding what a text implies rather than what it states. These are cognitive operations, and the key insight is this. The cognitive demand of a task can be shared across a class, even when proficiency levels differ significantly. What changes is not the intellectual work, it's the support structure for getting there. If you know anything about Vygotsky and social cultural theory, you'll recognize what I'm pointing at here. Learning happens in what he called the zone of proximal development, the space between what a learner can do alone and what they can do with support. In a heterogeneous classroom, that zone is not the same for everyone, obviously, but the target activity can still be shared. The interpretive act, the analytical move, the critical comparison, those can be common goals as long as access to them is differentiated. The mistake is thinking that heterogeneity means you cannot have a common intellectual challenge. You can. You just can't pretend everyone needs the same road to get there. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a step-by-step tutorial. That's not what this episode is for. But I do want to paint a picture of what this shift looks like in the classroom. Imagine the goal of a lesson is to identify authorial stance in a text. That's a genuinely high-level skill, and it's exactly the kind of thing that shows up in serious reading comprehension assessments. All students in the room can work towards that goal, but how they access it looks different. Some students might need a glossary. They might need guided questions that direct their attention to specific paragraphs. They might need sentence starters for articulating what they found. Others might work more independently. They might be asked to go deeper, to justify their interpretation using vocabulary choices in the text, or to compare how two authors position themselves differently on the same topic. The task is shared. The scaffolding is differentiated. The intellectual work doesn't get watered down anymore. And I think that's the real alternative to the leveling down approach, which, and this is something I feel very strongly about, actually tends to make things worse. When simplifying texts to the point where there's nothing to wrestle with, we don't help students with lower proficiency feel more confident. We just confirm implicitly that complex English is not for them. And we bore the students who could go further. There's also a professional dimension to this that I find really interesting. There's a body of research on what's sometimes called teacher cognition, which is how the mental models teachers hold about learning actually shape decisions they make in the classroom. And one of the patterns that show up in this research is that teachers who frame heterogeneity as a problem with the group, they tend to plan reactively. They are constantly trying to fix a situation, whereas teachers who frame heterogeneity as a predictable feature of contemporary classrooms, which it absolutely is, tend to plan anticipatorily. They design for variability from the start. That's not a small distinction. It completely changes your professional posture. One stance leaves you frustrated. The other leaves you in design mode. And design is something you actually have control over. So, where does that leave us? I'm not trying to suggest that this is easy. Teaching heterogeneous classrooms is genuinely demanding. Pacing is hard. Feedback is hard. Sometimes it's always. I'm not trying to suggest this is easy. Teaching heterogeneous groups is genuinely demanding. Pacing is hard. Feedback is hard, and time is always limited. But I do think the reframe helps. When you stop asking, how do I manage different levels, and start asking, how do I design shared intellectual work with multiple entry points, something opens up. The complexity of your classroom stops being an obstacle to your teaching and starts being a design parameter. And maybe that's the honest response to heterogeneity. Not to eliminate it, not to fight it, but to become the kind of teacher who builds with it in mind. That's it for this episode of Pedagogtech for English Teacher. If you resonated, if you would love to know what it brings up for you, what it makes you want to revisit in your own planning. That's it for this episode of Pedagogtech for English Teachers. If this resonated, I'd love to know what it brings up for you, what it makes you want to revisit in your own planning. Because I think the real work starts when the episode ends and you're standing in front of your group on a Tuesday morning. Thanks for listening. If you would like to read more, subscribe to pedagotechenglish.substack.com. See you next time.